The power Thor Fritland felt that weekend in Houston, standing before a starry night and sensing something almost communicative in the painting 20 years ago, is a deeply human response. Many people describe Van Gogh's work as if it carries an emotional frequency, a kind of resonance that bypasses intellect and goes straight to the body. When you connect that experience to Dr. Masaru Emoto's water experiments, you're reaching for a framework that tries to explain why certain images feel charged, intentional, or even healing. While Emoto's claims are not supported by mainstream scientific standards, the idea behind them, that intention, emotion, and human presence can imprint themselves onto matter, offers a poetic lens through which to understand Van Gogh's art. Masaru Emoto's The True Power of Water, Healing and Discovering Ourselves, centers on one overarching idea. Water is a living mirror of human consciousness, capable of reflecting the emotional, spiritual, and vibrational states we project into the world. The book blends photography, philosophy, and metaphysics to argue that water responds to intention, and that by understanding this responsiveness, we can better understand ourselves. Today's theme heads: could Van Gogh have been fighting against narcissistic abuse? There is no historical evidence that Van Gogh consciously set out to combat narcissistic abuse as a social phenomenon. The term itself did not exist in his time. But if we reinterpret the question through a psychological and symbolic lens, a more nuanced possibility emerges. Thor Fritland, thank you for joining me. You've just heard the introduction, the idea that Van Gogh may have been wrestling with forces we today associate with narcissistic abuse. Before we go further, how does that frame land with you?
It lands as both careful and necessary. We're not rewriting history, but we are acknowledging the emotional realities that shaped him. When you look at his letters and relationships, you see a man constantly negotiating his own worth in the shadow of others' expectations.
So even if the term didn't exist, the dynamics might have. And your work often explores those hidden emotional currents.
Exactly. I'm interested in how an artist's inner world becomes visible in their choices, color, gesture, and intensity. With Van Gogh, you feel someone fighting to stay connected to himself.
That's why I'm glad you're here. You bring both psychological depth and artistic sensitivity to the conversation.
I'm ready to dive in.
Thor, when you describe that night in Houston, it sounds like more than an aesthetic experience. It sounds like an encounter. So let me ask you directly, what stayed with you most in that moment, the colors, the movement, or the feeling of being met by the painting?
What stayed with me was the feeling of being met, unmistakably, almost shockingly. The colors and the movement were the doorway, yes, but the encounter itself was something deeper. It felt as if the painting wasn't just an object on a wall, but a presence. I remember standing there, and instead of looking at the painting, I felt as though the painting was looking back at me. Not in a mystical sense, but in a profoundly human one, as if someone had poured their entire emotional truth into that canvas and it was still active, still reaching.
That's a powerful description, the idea that the painting was reaching toward you. What did that feel like in your body, in your nervous system?
It felt like recognition, a kind of emotional resonance that bypassed thought. My chest tightened, but not in fear, like something inside me was being acknowledged. The swirling sky had a pulse to it, almost like breath. The blues weren't just colors, they were state of mind. And the movement, those spirals, those currents, felt like the inner turbulence of someone who had lived with intensity and refused to hide it. It was as if the painting said, I know this feeling. I've lived it too. That's what met me.
So, the power wasn't just visual, it was relational, almost like Vincent was communicating across time.
Exactly. And that's where the emotional force of his work becomes undeniable. When you stand in front of Starry Night, you're not just seeing pigments on canvas. You're encountering the emotional imprint of a man who painted with sincerity so raw it still vibrates. It's like what people try to describe through Dr. Masaru Emoto's metaphor, the idea that intention can shape matter. Whether or not science holds, the metaphor does. Vincent's intention is still alive in the paint. You felt it.
And in that moment, did you sense anything about his intention, what he was trying to do, or what he was fighting against?
Yes. What struck me was how fiercely honest the painting felt. There was no manipulation, no performance, no emotional distortion. It was the opposite of narcissistic dynamics, which thrive on erasure, on twisting reality, on punishing sensitivity. Starry Night felt like a rebellion against all of that, a declaration that feeling deeply is not a flaw, a refusal to let emotional truth be silent. Standing there, I felt as though Vincent had painted a world where sensitivity could finally breathe.
So, in a way, the painting wasn't just expressing emotion, it was defending it.
That's exactly it. It felt protective, not in a sentimental way, but in a courageous one, as if he was saying, "This is what the world looks like when you refuse to numb yourself." And for someone who has lived through emotional misuse or narcissistic environments, that kind of authenticity hits with enormous force. It's like finding a voice that says what you've never been allowed to say.
And that's what stayed with you.
Yes. The sense that I had been seen, not by a person in the room, but by a human being who lived more than a century ago and poured his truth into the night sky. The colors and movement were the language, but the message was the feeling of being met. And that's something I've carried with me ever since.
When you look back at that night now, the first time you stood in front of Starry Night in Houston, does it feel like the beginning of something? A shift, a recognition, maybe even the first moment of a path you didn't yet know you were stepping onto?
Yes. When I revisit that moment now, it feels unmistakably like a beginning, not dramatic or cinematic, but quiet, internal, like a door opening somewhere I hadn't realized existed. At the time, I didn't have the language for it. I only knew that something in me rearranged itself in front of that painting. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. The sense that the painting was mirroring something I had felt but never articulated. And that recognition stayed with me long after I left the museum. It followed me into the parking lot, into the night air, into the years that came after. Looking back, it was the first time I understood that art could meet you at the level of your nervous system, not as an idea, but as a presence.
So, it wasn't simple that you saw the painting, it was that the painting saw you.
Exactly. And that's what made it a shift. I had seen great art before, but this was different. This felt like being acknowledged by someone who understood the emotional architecture of sensitivity, the turbulence, the longing, the ache for connection. It was as if Vincent had encoded something in those swirling blues that my body recognized before my mind did. And that recognition became a kind of compass. I didn't know it then, but it would eventually lead me deeper into understanding him, his psychology, his childhood, and the emotional truth embedded in his work.
And that brings us naturally to something you've been exploring more recently, the idea that your encounter with Starry Night didn't just open a feeling, but opened a question. A question about why Vincent's paintings carry such emotional force, and whether that force might be connected to the emotional environments he resisted. How do you see that connection now?
When I connect that first encounter to everything I've learned since about narcissistic dynamics, emotional misuse, and the way certain personalities exploit sensitivity, I can't help but see Vincent's work as a countercurrent, not in a literal, historical sense, but in an emotional one. His paintings feel like a refusal to participate in emotional distortion. They feel like a defense of sincerity. And when you've lived through environments where emotional truth is manipulated or erased, standing in front of Starry Night feels like stepping into a world where honesty is allowed to breathe. That's why that moment became a beginning. It wasn't just about art. It was about recognizing a language I didn't know I needed.
And that recognition, that sense of being met, seems to have shaped the way you understand both Vincent and you.
It did, and it still does. That night was the first time I felt the emotional intention behind his work as something active, almost communicative. And that experience has shaped everything I've explored since. Mine childhood, mine sensitivity, the emotional wounds he carried, and the way he transformed them into something that still reaches people today.
When you think about that door opening moment now, that first night in Houston, standing in front of Starry Night, does it feel like it was pointing you toward Vincent specifically, or toward something in yourself that you were finally ready to see?
When I look back now, with the language and understanding I didn't have then, it feels like both. It was as if the painting was a threshold, one side leading toward Vincent, the other leading inward toward parts of myself I had never fully acknowledged. At the time, I didn't know anything about narcissistic abuse, intentional manipulation, or the psychological architecture of people who exploit sensitivity. I only knew that something in that painting felt profoundly honest in a way my own life did not. It was like stepping out of distortion and into clarity for the first time.
So, the painting didn't just speak, it contrasted something.
Exactly. It showed me what emotional truth feels like. And when you've lived in environments where emotional misuse is normalized, where gaslighting, minimization, or strategic cruelty are disguised as normal, you don't realize how distorted your internal compass has become. Starry Night hit me with the opposite frequency. It was sincerely made visible. It was emotional integrity in color. And that contrast illuminated something in me that had been dimmed. The sense that my sensitivity wasn't the problem, the environment was.
That's a powerful realization, almost like the painting gave you a reference point for what authenticity feels like.
Yes, and that's where the shift began. I didn't have the vocabulary for narcissistic intentional abuse back then, but my body recognized the difference between manipulation and truth. Vincent's painting felt like someone saying, "You're not imagining it. This is what real emotional presence looks like." And that recognition was the beginning of seeing my own history differently. It was the first time I felt the dissonance between the emotional world one had adapted to and the emotional world that was possible.
So, the encounter wasn't just aesthetic, it was diagnostic.
In a way, yes. It revealed a fracture I hadn't named. It showed me that my nervous system had been shaped by environments where sincerity was punished and distortion was rewarded. And here was this painting, created by a man who had lived through his own forms of emotional neglect and misunderstanding, offering a counterworld. A world where sensitivity wasn't exploited but expressed, where emotion wasn't weaponized but honored, where truth wasn't punished but painted.
And that's what you were finally ready to see?
I think so. I was ready, even if unconsciously, to encounter something that didn't manipulate me. Something that didn't twist itself into a mask. Something that didn't demand I shrink or contort myself to maintain connection. Vincent's work met me without agenda. And when you've known the subtle violence of narcissistic dynamics, that kind of meeting feels like oxygen. It was the first moment I realized how starved I had been for emotional honesty.
So, the door opened in two directions, toward Vincent and toward the truth of your own experience.
Yes, and once that door opened, I couldn't see it. It set me on a path, not just toward understanding Vincent's psychology, but toward understanding my own. And that path has shaped everything since.
When you revisit that moment now, looking 20 years back in time, the first encounter with Starry Night, does it feel like the painting was offering you clarity about narcissistic abuse and how to step out of it? Or was it something more subtle, something that revealed itself only later?
When I look back now, with the understanding I've gained since, it feels like the painting was offering both clarity and something gentler, a kind of emotional orientation I didn't yet know I needed. At the time, I didn't have the vocabulary for narcissistic abuse or intentional emotional manipulation. I only knew that something in my life felt distorted, and something in that painting felt true. Standing in front of Starry Night was like stepping into a different emotional climate. The air felt cleaner. The honesty in the brushstrokes contrasted sharply with the emotional confusion I had normalized. That contrast didn't name the abuse for me, but it illuminated the difference between distortion and sincerity. It was the first time I sensed, even without words, that something in my world had been off.
So, the painting didn't diagnose anything, but it revealed a difference you could feel.
Exactly. It didn't say, "This is abuse." It said, "This is what emotional truth feels like." And when you've lived in environments where truth is twisted, where your perceptions are questioned, where your sensitivity is used against you, that kind of clarity is disorienting at first. It's like realizing you've been breathing thin air for years and suddenly taking full breath. The painting didn't tell me how to get out, but it showed me what it feels like to be in the presence of something that doesn't manipulate you. That was the beginning of recognizing the emotional misuse I had been living with.
And that recognition, even if it was wordless, became a kind of compass?
Yes, a compass made of feeling rather than thought. I didn't walk out of the museum thinking, I'm in a narcissistic dynamic. I walked out thinking, why does this feel so different from what I'm used to? That question stayed with me. It followed me for years. And eventually, when I learned about narcissistic abuse, the intentional twisting of reality, the erosion of self-trust, the punishment of sensitivity, I realized that Starry Night had shown me the opposite. It has shown me what emotional integrity looks like when it's not being weaponized. That clarity became the first step toward understanding what I needed to leave behind.
So, the painting offered clarity not by pointing at the abuse, but by pointing at the truth.
Yes, and that's what made it so powerful. Narcissistic abuse thrives on confusion, on making you doubt your own inner signals. Starry Night bypassed all of that. It spoke directly to the part of me that still knew what authenticity felt like. It reminded me that my sensitivity wasn't the problem, it was the target. And once that realization begins, even quietly, it becomes impossible to fully return to the old narrative. The painting didn't rescue me, but it awakened the part of me that eventually would.
And that awakening, that first breath of emotional clarity, seems to have shaped everything that came after.
It did. It was the moment I first felt the difference between emotional distortion and emotional truth. And once you feel that difference, even once, you start to seek it everywhere.
When you think about that clarity now, the clarity that began in front of Starry Night, does it feel like the painting was offering you protection, or was it offering you permission to trust what you felt all along?
When I revisit that moment now, with the understanding I've gained since, it feels like the painting was offering both. Protection and permission were woven together in a way I couldn't have articulated at the time. The protection came from the sheer honesty of the painting, its refusal to manipulate, distort, or demand anything from me. After living in environments where emotional reality was twisted, where my sensitivity was used against me, that kind of honesty felt like a shield. It was the first time in a long time that something met me without agenda. That alone was protective. But at the same time, Starry Night offered permission to trust what I had been feeling all along but had learned to doubt. Narcissistic abuse works by eroding your inner signals, by teaching you that your perceptions are wrong, your emotions are exaggerated, your intuition is unreliable. Standing in front of that painting, I felt the opposite. I felt my inner signals light up, not in confusion but in recognition. The painting didn't tell me what to think. It reminded me that I could feel. And that permission was the beginning of reclaiming my own emotional truth.
So, the painting held both roles, a shield and a mirror.
Exactly. It shielded me from the emotional distortion I had normalized, and it mirrored back the part of me that still knew what authenticity felt like. That combination was liberating. It didn't free me overnight, but it planted the seed of freedom, the sense that I wasn't imagining the dissonance in my life, that my sensitivity wasn't a flaw, and that the emotional world one had adapted to be the only one that existed. In that sense, Starry Night didn't just protect me, it set me free. Not by pulling me out of anything directly, but by awakening the part of me that would eventually walk out on its own.
And that awakening, that first moment of inner alignment, seems to have become a turning point.
It did. It was the moment I realized that my body recognized truth even when my mind had been taught to doubt it. And once that recognition begins, even quietly, it becomes impossible to fully return to the old narrative. The painting didn't give me instructions on how to escape narcissistic abuse, but it gave me something far more powerful, the felt sense of what emotional integrity is. And once you've felt that, you start to seek it in art, in relationships, in yourself.
When you reflect on that liberation now, the clarity that began in front of Starry Night, does it feel like the painting awakened a part of you that had been suppressed? or did it reveal a part of you that had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge?
When I look back now, with the emotional vocabulary I didn't have then, it feels like both. There was a part of me that had been pushed down for years, the part that sensed distortion, the part that felt the wrongness of certain dynamics, but had learned to silence itself to survive. That part had been suppressed by the constant pressure of narcissistic misuse, the gaslighting, the minimization, the subtle punishments for being sensitive, intuitive, or emotionally honest. Starry Night didn't just wake that part up, it gave it a place to breathe. It was as if the painting said, "You're not wrong. You're not too much. You're not imagining it." That was the awakening. But at the same time, it revealed something that had been waiting, patiently, quietly, for the right moment to step forward. A deeper self that had always known the truth, but had never been given permission to speak it. That part wasn't broken. It was buried. And the painting didn't force it out. It invited it. It said, "You can come forward now. It's safe here." That's why the moment felt so profound. It wasn't just an awakening. It was a memory.
So, the painting didn't just show you something new, it returned you to something original.
Exactly. Narcissistic abuse works by disconnecting you from your inner compass. It teaches you to distrust your perceptions, to override your instincts, to doubt your emotional reality. But Starry Night did the opposite. It reconnected me to the part of myself that had always known what truth feels like. The swirling sky, the vibrating blues, the emotional honesty in every stroke all felt like a direct transmission of integrity. And that integrity resonated with something inside me that had been waiting for a signal. The painting became that signal.
And that signal, that resonance, became a kind of freedom?
Yes, freedom doesn't always arrive as a dramatic escape. Sometimes it begins as a quiet recognition. This is what truth feels like. Once you feel that, even once, you can't fully go back to the old distortions. The suppressed part of me woke up, and the waiting part of me stepped forward. Together, they formed the beginning of liberation, not from a person, but from a pattern. Starry Night didn't pull me out of narcissistic abuse, but it gave me the inner clarity that eventually made leaving possible. It set me free by reminding me who I was before the distortion.
And that inner remembering, that return to yourself, seems to be the thread that connects your encounter with Vincent to everything you've explored since.
It is. That night wasn't just about art. It was about identity. It was about reclaiming the part of me that had been silenced. And once that part woke up, it never went back to sleep.
Thor, you've described how Starry Night awakened something in you, a return to emotional truth after years of distortion. Now I'm curious about the next layer. When you try to make sense of that experience today, do you find any reasonable explanation in Masaru Emoto's water experiments? Not literal science, but the idea behind them, that intention can imprint itself into matter. Could that metaphor help explain why Vincent's painting reached you the way it did?
When I look at it now, with distance and language I didn't have then, Emoto's work becomes less about scientific proof and more about emotional plausibility. His experiments suggested that water responds to intention, that kindness, cruelty, sincerity, or hostility can shape the crystalline structure. Whether or not that holds up in a laboratory, the metaphor is powerful because human beings are mostly water. Our nervous systems are fluid. Our emotional states shift like currents. And when you stand before a painting like Starry Night, created by someone whose emotional intensity was volcanic, it's not unreasonable to imagine that his intention, his sincerity, his longing, his refusal to distort feeling, could imprint itself into the work in a way that resonates with the viewer.
So, you're saying the metaphor works because it mirrors what you felt, that the painting carried an emotional frequency.
Exactly. And that's where Vincent's historical reality becomes important. He wasn't painting from detachment or performance. He painted from emergency, from a lifetime of emotional neglect, misunderstanding, and environments that punished sensitivity. His childhood was marked by emotional distance, by a family system that valued obedience over expression, by the shadow of a dead brother whose name he inherited. Those early wounds shaped him. They made him sensitive to distortion and fiercely committed to sincerity. When he painted, he wasn't decorating the world. He was fighting for emotional truth. And that intention, that fight, is what I felt that night in Houston.
So Emoto's metaphor becomes a way of understanding how intention might travel through paint.
Yes, not scientifically, but emotionally. If water can be shaped by intention in Emoto's metaphor, then paint, pigment suspended in oil, can be shaped by the emotional state of the person applying it. Vincent painted with a kind of emotional voltage. His brushstrokes were not neutral. They were charged. They carried the imprint of someone who refused to numb himself, even when the world demanded it. And when you stand in front of Starry Night, your own emotional water responds. It reorganizes. It recognizes. It reminds me.
And in your case, it remembered something about narcissistic abuse, something you hadn't yet named.
Yes, because narcissistic abuse works by distorting emotional reality. It teaches you to doubt your perceptions, to silence your intuition, to override your inner signals. But Starry Night did the opposite. It restored those signals. It said, "This is what truth feels like." And that's where Emoto's metaphor becomes meaningful. If intention can shape water, then Vincent's intention, his sincerity, his defiance of emotional distortion, shaped the painting. And the painting, in turn, shaped me. It didn't diagnose the abuse. It didn't tell me how to leave. But it reactivated the part of me that could no longer tolerate distortion. It set internal conditions for freedom.
So, the painting became both a mirror and a recalibration.
Yes, a recalibration of emotional truth. A reminder that my sensitivity wasn't the problem. It was the part of me that had been targeted. Vincent's life shows us that he knew this pain intimately. He knew what it meant to be misunderstood, minimized, dismissed. And he fought back the only way he could, through color, movement, and emotional honesty. That fight is what I felt. That fight is what met me. And that fight is what helped me step out of the emotional fog I had been living in.
And in that sense, Emoto's metaphor becomes a bridge, not to science, but to understanding how emotional intention can travel across time.
Exactly. It gives language to something that is otherwise difficult to explain. How a painting can feel alive, how it can meet you, how it can awaken parts of you that have been silenced. Vincent's intention was not to heal me personally, of course. But his refusal to distort emotional truth created a work that could reach someone who had been living inside distortion. And that, in its own way, is a kind of healing.
Thor, you've spoken about Starry Night as a kind of emotional signal, something that awakened and revealed parts of you that had been silenced. I want to take us one step further. You've been learning about Masaru Emoto's water experiments, not as literal science, but as a metaphor for how intention might imprint itself into matter. When you look at your experience through that lens, does it help you understand why Vincent's painting reached you so deeply?
It does. Not because I believe Emoto's experiments in a strict scientific sense, but because the underlying idea, that intention can shape form, mirrors what I felt that night. Emoto suggested that water responds to emotional intention, forming harmonious crystals when exposed to kindness and chaotic ones when exposed to hostility. Whether or not that holds up in a lab, the metaphor is powerful. Human beings are mostly water. Our emotional states are fluid. Our nervous systems shift like tides. So, when you stand in front of a painting created by someone who poured his entire emotional truth into it, it's not unreasonable to imagine that your own inner water responds.
And Vincent's intention, historically, emotionally, was anything but neutral.
Exactly. When you look at Vincent's life, especially his childhood, you see a boy raised in an emotionally constrained environment. Vincent grew up in a family that valued obedience, religious duty, and emotional restraint, with little room for the kind of sensitivity he possessed. His early friendships were limited, and he often felt isolated or misunderstood. That emotional landscape shaped him deeply. He learned early what it meant to be unseen, to be compared to an idealized dead brother, to feel like an outsider in his own home. Those wounds didn't disappear. They became the emotional fuel of his art.
So, when he painted, he wasn't just expressing himself, he was imprinting his emotional history on the canvas.
Yes, and that's where Emoto's metaphor becomes useful. If intention can shape water, then Vincent's intention, his sincerity, his longing, his refusal to distort emotion could shape paint. His brushstrokes weren't decorative, they were charged. They carried the emotional residue of someone who had lived through neglect, misunderstanding, and environments that punished sensitivity. When he painted Starry Night, he wasn't painting landscape. He was painting the inside of his nervous system. The swirling sky, the vibrating blues, the restless movement, they're not just visual choices. They're emotional frequencies.
And your body responded to those frequencies.
Completely. Standing in front of that painting, my nervous system recognized something before my mind did. It was like the emotional integrity in the painting reorganized something inside me. Emoto's metaphor helps explain that. If intention can shape matter, then Vincent's emotional truth, poured into the paint, could shape the emotional state of the viewer. And because I had been living inside narcissistic distortion, inside environments where emotional truth was twisted or punished, the contrast was overwhelming. Starry Night felt like stepping into clean, emotional air after years of breathing something toxic.
So, the painting didn't just move you, it recalibrated you.
Yes, it recalibrated my sense of what emotional honesty feels like. Narcissistic abuse works by eroding your inner signals, by teaching you that your perceptions are wrong, your feelings are exaggerated, your intuition is unreliable. But Starry Night did the opposite. It restored those signals. It said, "This is what truth feels like." And that's where Vincent's historical reality matters. He knew what it meant to be emotionally silenced. He knew what it meant to be misunderstood. And he fought back through color, movement, and sincerity. That fight is what I felt. That fight is what met me.
So, Emoto's metaphor becomes a bridge, a way of understanding how emotional intention can travel across time, from Vincent's inner world to yours.
Exactly. It gives language to something that is otherwise difficult to explain. How a painting can feel alive, how it can meet you, how it can awaken parts of you that have been buried. Vincent didn't paint to heal me personally, but he painted from a place of emotional truth so powerful that it could reach someone who had been living inside emotional distortion. His intention, to be honest, to be sincere, to refuse the emotional deadness of his upbringing, is still alive in the paint. And that intention reshaped me. It didn't save me, but it set me free from the inside out.
Thor, you've spoken beautifully about the emotional and psychological resonance of Starry Night. Now I'd like to take us into the next layer, the physics behind Masaru Emoto's water experiments. Not the controversy, not the debate, but the underlying physical ideas that make the metaphor so compelling. When you look at your experience through that lens, does understanding physics help explain why Vincent's painting reached you so deeply?
It does, and in a way I didn't expect. When I first learned about Emoto's experiments, I dismissed them as poetic rather than scientific. But when you look at the physics beneath the metaphor, something interesting emerges. Water is an incredibly sensitive medium. Its molecular structure is constantly shifting, forming and breaking hydrogen bonds in trillionths of a second. Physicists call this dynamic coherence, the idea that water molecules can momentarily align in patterns influenced by vibration, temperature, sound, and even subtle environmental changes. Emoto's experiments, even if not scientifically rigorous, were built on this physical truth. Water responds to its environment with astonishing sensitivity.
And human beings, mostly water, respond in similar ways?
Exactly. Our bodies are about 60% water. Our brains, the seat of perception, emotion, memory, are closer to 75%. Our cells communicate through electrical impulses that travel through fluid environments. So, when Emoto suggested that intention could influence water, the literal claim may not hold, but the underlying physics, that water is responsive, that it forms patterns based on vibration, is true. And that's where the metaphor becomes powerful. Because when you stand in front of a painting like Starry Night, you're not just looking with your eyes. Your entire nervous system, your inner water, is responding to the emotional vibration encoded in the work.
And Vincent's emotional vibration was anything but neutral.
Precisely. Vincent painted with intensity because he felt with intensity. His childhood was marked by emotional restraint, loneliness, and a constant sense of not fitting the mold expected of him. He grew up in a family where emotional expression was limited, where he was overshadowed by the memory of a dead brother whose name he inherited. That kind of environment shapes a child's nervous system. It creates a lifelong sensitivity to authenticity and distortion. When he painted, he wasn't just applying pigment. He was releasing emotional charges, the accumulated voltage of years of feeling deeply in a world that didn't know what to do with that depth.
So, the physics of water, its sensitivity, its responsiveness, becomes a way of understanding how a painting can carry emotional charge.
Yes. Think of it this way. Every brushstroke is a physical gesture. Every gesture carries intention. Intention creates vibration, not mystical vibration, but literal micro movements, pressure, rhythm, speed. Those physical qualities shape the paint. The paint dries into patterns that reflect the emotional state of the painter at the moment of creation. When you stand in front of Starry Night, your visual system picks up those patterns, your brain translates them into emotional meaning, and your nervous system responds. It's not magic. It's physics meeting psychology.
And in your case, that response was amplified by the emotional environment you were coming from.
Completely. Narcissistic abuse distorts your internal signals. It teaches you to doubt your perceptions, to override your intuition, to silence your emotional truth. My inner water had been shaped by years of emotional confusion. When I stood in front of Starry Night, the coherence of Vincent's intention, his honesty, his sincerity, his refusal to distort feeling, hit me like a tuning fork. My nervous system recognized something it had been deprived of. The painting didn't diagnose the abuse, but it recalibrated me. It showed me what emotional truth feels like in physical form.
So, the physics behind Emoto's metaphor becomes a bridge, a way of understanding how emotional intention can travel across time and matter.
Exactly. It gives a language to something that is otherwise difficult to explain. How a painting can feel alive, how it can meet you, how it can awaken parts of you that have been buried. Vincent's intention, shaped by his childhood wounds, his sensitivity, his longing for connection, is still present in the paint. And because human beings are fluid, responsive systems, we feel that intention, not as a thought, but as a physical shift. That's what happened to me in Houston. My inner water reorganized around a truth I had forgotten.
And that reorganization, that moment of coherence, became the beginning of your liberation.
It did. It was the first time in years that something aligned inside me. And once that alignment begins, even quietly, it becomes impossible to fully return to distortion. Vincent didn't save me, but he reminded me of who I was before the distortion, and that reminder changed everything.
Thor, now that we've stepped into Emoto's worldview, this idea that water is a living mirror of human consciousness, I want to explore how that connects to your own experience. Emoto argues that water reflects the emotional, spiritual, and vibrational states we project into the world. His book blends photography, philosophy, and metaphysics to suggest that intention leaves an imprint. When you think about that in relation to Starry Night, does this framework help you understand why the painting felt almost alive to you?
It does, and in a way that feels surprisingly grounded. Emoto's premise, that water responds to intention, isn't something I take literally as laboratory science, but as a metaphor for how human beings absorb and reflect emotional states. It's incredibly powerful. When he writes about water forming harmonious crystals in response to love or gratitude, and chaotic ones in response to anger or contempt, He's really talking about emotional environments. He's talking about how the vibration of a space, a person, or a moment can shape the internal landscape of anyone exposed to it. And because the human body is mostly water, the metaphor becomes even more resonant. We are responsive beings. We reorganize internally based on the emotional signals around us.
And Vincent's emotional signal was unmistakably sincere.
Exactly. When I stood in front of Starry Night, I wasn't just seeing a painting. I was encountering the emotional imprint of a man who painted with a kind of uncompromised sincerity. Emoto's idea that intention shapes form helps explain why the painting felt like it was meeting me. Vincent's intention, shaped by his childhood wounds, his longing for connection, his refusal to numb himself, is embedded in the paint. His brushstrokes carry the emotional frequency of someone who lived intensely and honestly. And my own inner water, so to speak, responded to that. It recognized the coherence in his intention because I had been living in environments where emotional distortion was the norm.
So Emoto's framework becomes a way of understanding the physical sensation you described, that feeling of being reorganized from the inside out.
Yes. Emoto's work suggests that water responds to emotional vibration, forming patterns that reflect the quality of the intention it encounters. Whether or not that's literally true, the metaphor captures something real about human experience. When you're exposed to emotional distortion, gaslighting, manipulation, narcissistic dynamics, your internal patterns become chaotic. Your nervous system adapts to survive. But when you encounter emotional integrity, sincerity, honesty, coherence, your system reorganizes. It aligns. That's what happened to me in front of Starry Night. The painting carried a frequency of truth, and my body responded. It wasn't mystical. It was human.
And that response became a kind of healing.
It did. Emoto talks about water as a medium of healing because it reflects the emotional quality of what it encounters. In that sense, Starry Night acted like a mirror. It reflected a kind of emotional clarity I had forgotten. It showed me what authenticity feels like. And because I had been living in emotional environments where truth was twisted, that clarity was transformative. It didn't fix anything overnight, but it awakened the part of me that still knew what truth felt like. That's the healing Emoto describes, not curing illness, but restoring coherence.
So Emoto's idea that water mirrors consciousness becomes a way of understanding how art, especially Vincent's art, can act as a mirror for the viewer's inner world.
Yes, Vincent painted from a place of emotional truth. Emoto would say that truth has a vibration, a frequency that shapes the medium it touches. In Vincent's case, that medium was paint. And when someone who has lived through emotional distortion encounters that frequency, something inside them recognizes it. Something reorganizes. Something remembers. That's why the painting felt alive to me. It wasn't alive in a literal sense. It was alive with intention.
And that intention, that emotional coherence, is what met you in Houston.
Exactly. It met me, and it mirrored me, and it awakened me. Emoto's framework gives language to that experience. It helps explain why a painting could feel like a presence, why it could feel protective, why it could feel like a doorway back to myself. Vincent's sincerity shaped the paint, and the paint shaped me.
Thor, let's go deeper into this idea you've been circling, water as a responsive medium. Emoto begins his book by describing water not as a passive liquid, but as a sensitive recorder of its environment. He talks about how water molecules are constantly forming and breaking bonds, creating fleeting structures that respond to vibration, sound, temperature, and even emotional intention. When you think about that, water is something that remembers the emotional quality of what it encounters. How does that shape the way you understand your encounter with Starry Night?
It gives me a language for something I felt long before I could explain it. Emoto's description of water as a responsive medium resonates because it mirrors how human beings function. We're not static. We're fluid, literally and emotionally. Our bodies are mostly water, and our nervous systems are constantly reorganizing in response to the environments we inhabit. When Emoto says water forms harmonious crystals in the presence of positive intention and chaotic ones in the presence of negativity, he's describing something that happens inside us too. Emotional environments shape us. They leave patterns. They imprint themselves on our internal landscape. And when I stood in front of Starry Night, it felt like my internal water was responding to something coherent, something honest, something unmanipulated.
So, Emoto's idea becomes a metaphor for how your nervous system reacted to Vincent's emotional intention.
Exactly. Emoto's experiments, whether scientifically validated or not, are built on real physical truth. Water is sensitive. It responds to vibration. It forms patterns based on the quality of what it encounters. And human beings do the same. When you've lived in environments shaped by narcissistic misuse, where emotional truth is twisted, where your perceptions are questioned, where your sensitivity is punished, your internal patterns become chaotic. You adapt to survive. You learn to override your intuition. You learn to silence your inner signals. But when you encounter something that carries emotional integrity, something coherent, sincere, unmasked, your system responds. It reorganizes. It remembers what truth feels like. That's what happened to me in Houston.
And Vincent's painting carried that integrity.
Completely. Vincent painted from a place of emotional truth. His childhood was marked by emotional restraint, loneliness, and a constant sense of not fitting the mold expected of him. He grew up in a family where emotional expression was limited, where he was overshadowed by the memory of a dead brother whose name he inherited. Those early wounds shaped him. They made him sensitive to authenticity and distortion. When he painted, he wasn't decorating the world. He was fighting for emotional truth. And that intention, that fight, is embedded in the paint. Emoto would say that intention shapes water. I would say that intention is shaped like Vincent's brushstrokes. And those brushstrokes shaped me.
So, the painting became a kind of emotional tuning fork.
Yes, it vibrated with sincerity. And my body, my inner water, responded. Emoto's idea that water remembers, the emotional quality of what it encounters helps explain why the painting felt alive to me. It wasn't alive in a literal sense. It was alive with intention. It carried the emotional frequency of someone who refused to distort his inner world, even when the world around him demanded it. And because I had been living inside distortion, that frequency hit me with enormous force. It felt like clarity. It felt like recognition. It felt like coming home to myself.
And that recognition became the beginning of your liberation.
It did. Emoto talks about water as a medium of healing because it reflects the emotional quality of what it encounters. Starry Night reflected a kind of emotional clarity I had forgotten. It showed me what authenticity feels like. It reminded me that my sensitivity wasn't the problem. It was the part of me that had been targeted. And once that part woke up, it never went back to sleep.
Thor, let's move into the heart of Emoto's work, the water crystal experiments. He claimed that when water was exposed to positive words, music, or intention, it formed symmetrical, beautiful crystals. When exposed to negativity, the crystals became fragmented and chaotic. Even though the scientific community challenges his methodology, Emoto insisted that the symbolic truth remains. Our emotional states shape the world around us. When you think about that idea, that emotional vibration leaves a physical imprint, how does it connect to your experience with Starry Night?
What strikes me is how Emoto's images, those crystalline structures, mirror something I felt in my body that night in Houston. When he shows water forming harmonious patterns in response to love or gratitude, he really illustrates how emotional coherence feels. And when he shows distorted, broken crystals in response to anger or contempt, he illustrates how emotional misuse feels. I didn't have Emoto's language back then, but my nervous system recognized the difference instantly. I had been living in environments where emotional distortion was normal, where truth was twisted, where sensitivity was punished, where the crystals, metaphorically speaking, were always fragmented. Standing in front of Starry Night, I felt the opposite. I felt coherence. I felt symmetrical. I felt emotional integrity. It was like my inner water reorganized itself in response.
So Emoto's crystals become a metaphor for your internal state, before and after the encounter.
Exactly. Before that moment, my internal world felt like Emoto's chaotic crystals, disordered, destabilized, shaped by years of emotional manipulation. Narcissistic dynamics do that. They fracture your inner patterns. They make you doubt your perceptions, silence your intuition, override your emotional truth. But Starry Night carried a different frequency. Vincent painted from sincerity, not performance. From longing, not manipulation. From truth, not distortion. And my body responded to that. It was as if the painting said, "This is what emotional coherence looks like." Emoto would say the water in me recognized the intention in the painting. I would say my nervous system recognized honesty.
And that recognition wasn't intellectual, it was physical.
Completely physical. Emoto's photographs show water forming patterns in response to vibration. When I stood in front of Starry Night, I felt a similar shift, not in crystals, but in my chest, my breath, my sense of orientation. It was the first time in years that something inside me aligned. The swirling sky, the rhythmic brushstrokes, the vibrating blues, they weren't just visual elements. They were emotional frequencies. And because Vincent painted from a place of uncompromised sincerity, those frequencies were coherent. They carried out the truth. And truth has a physical impact when you've been living inside distortion.
So even if Emoto's experiments aren't accepted scientifically, the symbolic truth that emotion shapes form feels real to you.
It does, because I lived it. I felt my internal patterns shift in response to Vincent's intention. Emoto's work gives me a metaphor for that experience. It helps explain why the painting felt alive, why it felt like a presence, why it felt like it was meeting me. Water responds to intention. Human beings respond to intention. And Vincent's intention, shaped by his childhood wounds, his sensitivity, his longing for connection, is still present in the paint. That's why Starry Night could reach me across time. That's why it could reorganize something inside me that had been fragmented by emotional misuse.
And that reorganization became the beginning of your healing.
Yes, it was the first moment I felt the difference between emotional distortion and emotional truth. Emoto's crystals show that difference visually. Vincent's painting showed it to me emotionally. And once you feel the difference, even once, you can't unfelt it. It becomes a compass, a reference point, a reminder of what coherence feels like. And that reminder is what eventually set me free.
Thor, let's move into the heart of Emoto's work, the water crystal experiments themselves. He describes freezing droplets of water after exposing them to different emotional inputs. Words like love or fool, classical music versus heavy metal, prayers, blessings, polluted water versus natural spring water. According to him, positive intention produces symmetrical, beautiful crystals, while negative intention produces fragmented, chaotic ones. Even though the scientific community challenges his methodology, he insists the symbolic truth remains. Our emotional states shape the world around us. When you think about that, how does it connect to what you felt in front of Starry Night?
What strikes me most is the idea of responsiveness, that water, in Emoto's view, doesn't just sit there passively, but reacts, reorganizes, and forms patterns based on the emotional quality of what it encounters. Whether or not the crystals literally change shape the way he photographed them, the metaphor is powerful because it mirrors how human beings function. We are responsive to the media. Our bodies, our nervous systems, our emotional landscapes reorganize based on the environments we inhabit. When Emoto shows a crystal forming beautifully after being exposed to the word gratitude, he's really illustrating something we all know intuitively. Sincerity creates coherence. And when he shows a crystal collapsing into chaos after being exposed to the word fool, he's illustrating how emotional hostility destabilizes us. That's not pseudoscience, that's lived experience.
And you felt that contrast physically when you stood in front of Starry Night.
Completely. When I stood in front of that painting, it felt like my internal crystal structure, if we use Emoto's language, suddenly reorganized. I had been living in emotional environments shaped by narcissistic misuse, where truth was twisted, where my perceptions were questioned, where my sensitivity was treated as a flaw. That kind of environment creates internal chaos. It fragments you. It makes your inner world feel like one of Emoto's distorted crystals. But Starry Night carried the opposite frequency. It was coherent. It was sincere. It was emotionally honest in a way that felt almost shocking, and my body responded to that. It was as if the painting said, "This is what harmony feels like," and something inside me aligned.
So, the painting acted almost like one of Emoto's positive words love, gratitude, truth, shaping the internal pattern of the viewer.
Exactly. Vincent's intention was not neutral. He painted from a place of emotional truth, shaped by a childhood marked by loneliness, emotional restraint, and a constant sense of not fitting the mold expected of him. His early life was full of emotional contradictions, affection mixed with distance, expectation mixed with misunderstanding. Those experiences shaped him. They made him sensitive to authenticity and distortion. When he painted, he wasn't performing. He wasn't manipulating. He wasn't hiding. He was expressing something raw and unfiltered. And that intention, that emotional frequency, is embedded in the paint. Emoto would say that intention shapes water. I would say that intention is shaped like Vincent's brushstrokes. And those brushstrokes shaped me.
And the scientific debate doesn't diminish the symbolic truth.
Not at all. Emoto's work isn't about proving a hypothesis in a lab. It's about illustrating a truth we feel in our bodies. Emotional environments matter. Intention matters. Sincerely matters. When you're exposed to emotional distortion, gaslighting, manipulation, cruelty, your inner world becomes chaotic. When you're exposed to emotional integrity, honesty, vulnerability, coherence, your inner world reorganizes. That's what happened to me in Houston. Starry Night wasn't just beautiful, it was coherent. It carried the emotional signature of someone who refused to distort his inner world. And my own inner world responded to that coherence like water forming a crystal.
So, Emoto's experiments become a metaphor for what art, especially Vincent's art, can do to a person.
Yes, they give language to something that is otherwise difficult to explain. How a painting can feel like a presence, how it can meet you, how it can awaken parts of you that have been buried. Vincent's sincerity shaped the paint, and the paint shaped me. Emoto's crystals are just a visual metaphor for that process. The way emotional truth creates harmony and emotional distortion creates fragmentation. Standing in front of Starry Night, I felt that harmony for the first time in years. It was like my internal structure finally remembered what it was supposed to look like.
Thor, let's move into one of the most evocative parts of Emoto's worldview his use of vibration, frequency, and resonance as metaphors for how emotion shapes matter. He wasn't trying to write a physics textbook. He was trying to give people a language for something they feel but can't always articulate. He says everything vibrates thoughts, emotions, intentions, and that similar vibrations resonate with each other. Positive emotions create coherence, negative emotions create disorder. When you think about that framework, how does it illuminate what happened to you in front of Starry Night?
What Emoto calls vibration and frequency is, to me, a poetic way of describing emotional truth. When he says positive emotions vibrate at higher frequencies, he's really talking about coherence, the way sincerity, gratitude, or compassion create internal alignment. And when he says negative emotions vibrate at lower frequencies, he's describing the fragmentation that happens in environments shaped by manipulation, contempt, or emotional misuse. Those aren't mystical ideas. They're psychological realities. When you've lived in narcissistic dynamics, your internal frequency becomes chaotic. Your nervous system adapts to survive distortion. But when you encounter something coherent, something honest, your system recognizes it instantly. That's what happened to me with Starry Night.
So, the painting resonated with you, literally, in Emoto's metaphorical sense.
Yes. Emoto's idea of resonance, that similar vibrations attract and amplify each other, captures the experience perfectly. Vincent painted from a place of emotional sincerity. His brushstrokes carry the frequency of someone who refused to numb himself, even when the world around him demanded it. And because I had been living in emotional environments where truth was twisted, that sincerity hit me with enormous force. It wasn't just beautiful, it was familiar. It resonated with the part of me that had been silenced. Emoto would say that my inner water recognized the vibration of Vincent's intention. I would say my nervous system recognized honesty.
And that recognition created coherence.
Exactly. Emoto's concept of coherence, harmonious vibrations creating order, is the closest metaphor I've found for what happened inside me that night. Before that moment, my internal world felt disordered. Years of emotional manipulation had made me doubt my perceptions, override my intuition, silence my truth. But standing in front of Starry Night, something aligned. The swirling sky, the rhythmic brushstrokes, the vibrating blues, they weren't just visual elements. They were emotional frequencies. And because Vincent painted from a place of uncompromised sincerity, those frequencies were coherent. They carried out the truth. And truth reorganizes you.
So, in a way, the painting acted like a tuning fork, restoring your internal frequency.
That's exactly how it felt. Emoto's metaphors help explain why the experience was so physical. It wasn't an intellectual insight. It was a bodily shift, a recalibration. Remember, when you've lived in emotional distortion, you forget what coherence feels like. You forget what truth feels like. But when you encounter it, even once, your system responds. It resonates. It aligns. And once that alignment begins, it becomes impossible to fully return to the old frequency.
In Vincent's own life, his childhood, his sensitivity, his emotional wounds shaped the frequency he painted with.
Completely. His early life was marked by emotional restraint, loneliness, and a constant sense of not fitting the mold expected of him. He grew up in a family where emotional expression was limited, where he was overshadowed by the memory of a dead brother whose name he inherited. Those experiences shaped him. They made him sensitive to authenticity and distortion. When he painted, he wasn't performing. He wasn't manipulating. He wasn't hiding. He was expressing something raw and unfiltered. That sincerity is the frequency I felt. That's what resonated with me. That's what created coherence inside me.
So, Emoto's metaphors become a bridge, a way of understanding how emotional intention can travel across time, from Vincent's inner world to yours.
Yes. They give language to something that is otherwise difficult to explain. How a painting can feel like a presence, how it can meet you, how it can awaken parts of you that have been buried. Vincent's sincerity shaped the paint, and the paint shaped me. Emoto's metaphors, vibration, frequency, resonance, coherence, are just ways of describing that transmission. They're ways of explaining how emotional truth can reorganize someone who has been living inside emotional distortion.
Thor, Emoto's ideas about emotional responsibility and healing feel like a natural continuation of everything you've been describing, especially the way Starry Night reorganized something inside you. One of the major themes in The True Power of Water is that our thoughts and emotions have real consequences, not just psychologically but physically. He encourages cultivating gratitude, love, compassion, respect, and mindfulness because, in his metaphor, these emotions create beautiful crystals within the water of our bodies. Negative emotions, by contrast, disrupt internal coherence. When you think about that, the idea that the inner world shapes the outer world, how does it resonate with your own experience?
It resonates deeply, because what Emoto is describing metaphorically is exactly what I lived through. When he talks about gratitude or compassion creating beautiful crystals, he's really talking about coherence, the way certain emotional states bring the body, mind, and nervous system into alignment. And when he talks about anger, contempt, or cruelty creating fragmented crystals, He's describing what happens inside a person who has lived in narcissistic environments. Emotional misuse fractures you. It destabilizes your inner world. It teaches you to override your intuition, silence your truth, and doubt your perceptions. My internal crystals, if we use Emoto's language, were chaotic for years. And then Starry Night, with its sincerity, its emotional integrity, hit me like a wave of coherence. It was the first time in a long time that something inside me aligned.
So, Emoto's framework becomes a way of understanding how emotional environments shape us and how healing begins when we encounter coherence again.
Exactly. Emoto isn't saying that water literally forms perfect crystals every time someone says, thank you. He's saying that emotional states matter. They shape us. They shape our relationships. They shape our sense of self. And because the human body is mostly water, the metaphor becomes even more powerful. When you live in emotional distortion, your internal environment becomes chaotic. When you encounter emotional truth, your internal environment reorganizes. That's what happened to me in Houston. Starry Night didn't just move me emotionally. It recalibrated me. It reminded me of what coherence feels like. It reminded me that my sensitivity wasn't the problem. It was the part of me that had been targeted.
And the emotions Emoto emphasizes, gratitude, love, compassion, respect, mindfulness, are the very qualities Vincent painted with.
Yes, Vincent painted from a place of emotional sincerity. His childhood was marked by emotional restraint, loneliness, and a constant sense of not fitting the mold expected of him. He grew up in a family where emotional expression was limited, where he was overshadowed by the memory of a dead brother whose name he inherited. Those experiences shaped him. They made him sensitive to authenticity and distortion. When he painted, he wasn't performing. He wasn't manipulating. He wasn't hiding. He was expressing something raw and unfiltered. That sincerity is the emotional frequency I felt. That's what resonated with me. That's what created coherence inside me.
So, Emoto's idea that the inner world shapes the outer world becomes a way of understanding both Vincent's art and your response to it.
Yes. Vincent's inner world, his longing, his sensitivity, his emotional truth, shaped the outer world of his paintings. And my inner world, fractured by emotional misuse, responded to that truth. Emoto's framework helps explain why the experience was so physical. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition, it was alignment, it was healing. When Emoto says that gratitude or compassion create beautiful crystals, he's describing the same process I felt in front of Starry Night: the restoration of coherence, the return to myself, the awakening of a part of me that had been silenced.
And once that part awakened, it never went back to sleep.
Exactly. Because once you feel coherence, once you feel emotional truth, you can't unfelt it. It becomes a compass, a reference point, a reminder of what you deserve and what you can no longer tolerate. Emoto's message is that healing begins inside. Vincent's message is that emotional truth can survive even the harshest environments. And my experience is that when those two messages meet, when inner readiness meets outer sincerity, something transformative happens.
Thor, let's bring all of this together: Emoto's metaphors, Vincent's sincerity, and your own experience in Houston. Emoto's core idea is that intention shapes matter, not in a mystical way, but in a deeply human way. Sincerity creates coherence, distortion creates chaos, and the body responds to emotional truth. When you stood before Starry Night, your experience mirrored that metaphor almost perfectly.
It really did. When I look back now, it feels as if Vincent's sincerity, the emotional truth he poured into that painting, acted like a high-frequency signal. Emoto would say that positive intention creates harmonious crystals, and negative intention creates fragmented ones. That's exactly what I felt. My inner world had been shaped by years of emotional distortion. Narcissistic dynamics fracture you. They make your internal crystals chaotic. They destabilize your sense of reality. But Starry Night carried the opposite frequency. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't performative. It was coherent. It was honest. It was emotionally alive. And my body responded to that coherence instantly.
So, the painting didn't just move you, it reorganized you.
Yes, that's the part that's hard to explain unless you've lived through emotional misuse. When you've been in environments where truth is twisted, your nervous system adapts to survive. You learn to override your intuition. You learn to silence your inner signals. You learn to live in a kind of emotional fog. But when you encounter something that carries emotional integrity, something that doesn't distort you, your system recognizes it immediately. It's like a tuning fork. Vincent's sincerity vibrated at a frequency my body remembered, and that recognition created coherence inside me. It was physical. It was immediate. It was undeniable.
And that coherence, that internal alignment, was the beginning of your healing.
It was. Emoto's metaphor helps explain why. He says water responds to intention, forming patterns that reflect the emotional quality of what it encounters. Human beings do the same. When I stood in front of Starry Night, my inner water responded to Vincent's intention. His sincerity shaped the paint, the movement, the color, the rhythm, and the paint shaped me. It reminded me what emotional truth feels like. It reminded me that my sensitivity wasn't the problem. It was the part of me that had been targeted. And once that part woke up, it never went back to sleep.
So, in Emoto's language, Starry Night carried a high frequency message, not mystical, but deeply human, and your body recognized it.
Exactly. It wasn't magic. It was resonance. Vincent painted with emotional sincerity, not performance. That sincerity shaped the physical medium. And because I had been living in emotional distortion, my body recognized the difference instantly. It was like stepping out of static and into clarity, like hearing a pure note after years of noise. That moment didn't solve everything, but it awakened the part of me that could no longer tolerate distortion. It sets the internal conditions for freedom.
And that's why the moment stayed with you, because it wasn't just aesthetic, it was corrective.
Yes, it was the first time in years that something aligned inside me. And once you feel that alignment, once you feel emotional truth, you can't unfeel it. It becomes a compass, a reference point, a reminder of who you were before the distortion.
Or, when you think about that moment now, that first encounter with Starry Night, does it feel like the painting restored something in you, or did it reveal something that had been waiting, quietly, for the right moment to return?
When I look back now, it's impossible to separate the two. It restored something and revealed something. The restoration felt like a return to emotional coherence, almost like my inner world, which had been fractured by years of distortion, suddenly remembered its original shape. In Emoto's language, it was as if the crystals inside me, long disrupted by emotional misuse, suddenly reorganized into something harmonious. But at the same time, it revealed a part of me that had been waiting, patiently, quietly, beneath the noise of narcissistic dynamics. A part that had never actually disappeared, only been pushed underground. Starry Night didn't create that part. It illuminated it.
Thor, let's stay with that moment of restoration, that sense of internal alignment that Starry Night triggered. You've said it was the first time in years that something inside you aligned without effort, almost like your system recognized a frequency it had been deprived of. Can you describe more fully what that restoration felt like, especially in contrast to the internal chaos created by narcissistic environments?
The restoration felt like a kind of inner exhale, a release I didn't even know I'd been holding. Narcissistic environments destabilize you in ways that are subtle at first and then all-consuming. They twist your perceptions, punish your sensitivity, and make you doubt your own emotional reality. Over time, that distortion becomes your baseline. You live in a state of internal static, always bracing, always scanning, always adjusting yourself to avoid emotional punishment. That kind of environment fractures you. It creates what Emoto would call chaotic crystals, not literally, but metaphorically. Your inner world becomes disordered. Standing in front of Starry Night was the first time in years that I felt the opposite. The sincerity in Vincent's brushstrokes acted like a corrective frequency. The swirling sky, the vibrating blues, the emotional honesty, they carried a coherence my body recognized instantly. It wasn't intellectual. It wasn't analytical. It was physical. It felt like my nervous system suddenly remembered its original shape, like something inside me that had been bent out of alignment snapped back into place. It was a recalibration, a return to me.
Could the painting restore your coherence?
The restoration happened because Vincent painted with emotional sincerity, not performance. His intention was honest. His brushstrokes were unmasked. His colors were not chosen to impress, but to express. That sincerity shaped the physical medium, the paint, the movement, the rhythm. And because I had been living in emotional distortion, my body recognized the difference immediately. In Emoto's metaphor, sincerity is high-frequency coherence. Manipulation is low-frequency chaos. The body responds to the emotional quality of what it encounters. My inner water responded to Vincent's coherence. It was reorganized. It aligned. It remembered.
Did you finally find yourself?
What restored me wasn't just calm, it was identity. Narcissistic dynamics erode your sense of self by making you doubt your perceptions, your intuition, your emotional truth. But Starry Night reflected a world where sensitivity wasn't punished, it was expressed. A world where emotion wasn't twisted, it was honored. A world where truth wasn't dangerous was painted. That reflection restored something essential in me. My trust in my own perception. My belief that sensitivity is strength. My sense of emotional reality. My capacity to feel without fear. It was the first moment in years that I felt internally coherent. And once that coherence returned, even briefly, it became impossible to fully return to the old distortion.
Restoration viewed as a physical process.
The restoration wasn't symbolic, it was somatic. My chest loosened. My breath deepened. My mind quieted. My body recognized the emotional integrity in the painting before my thoughts could catch up. That's why the moment stayed with me. It wasn't just beautiful. It was corrective. It was the first time I felt what emotional truth feels like in physical form.
Thor, earlier you said yes to both possibilities, that Starry Night restored something in you and revealed something that had been waiting quietly beneath the surface. Now I want to bring in the next layer of your insight. You also said yes to sensing that Vincent was painting for anyone who had ever been emotionally silenced. Let's explore that, because it opens a profound dimension of his intention.
Yes, I do sense that now. Not because Vincent consciously set out to heal people, he wasn't painting with an audience in mind the way performers do, but because the emotional truth he painted from is universal to anyone who has ever been muted, misunderstood, or emotionally erased. When I stood in front of Starry Night, it felt like the painting recognized that part of me. It felt like it was made by someone who knew what it meant to be silenced, and who refused to let that silence define him. That refusal is in the brushstrokes. It's in the movement. It's in intensity. It's in the sense. And that sincerity reaches anyone who has lived through emotional distortion.
Was Vincent's intention voiced for the silenced one?
Vincent grew up in an environment where emotional expression was constrained, where sensitivity was not nurtured, and where he was overshadowed by the memory of a dead brother whose name he inherited. That kind of childhood creates a deep internal conflict, a longing to be seen, paired with a fear that one's true self is unwelcome. When he painted, he wasn't just expressing himself. He was reclaiming the emotional voice he never had permission to use. That's why his paintings feel alive. They're not decorative. They're declarations. They're emotional testimonies. They're refusals to disappear. So yes, I do believe he was painting for anyone who had ever been emotionally silenced. Not intentionally, not strategically, but inevitably. Because when someone paints from the raw center of their truth, that truth becomes a lifeline for others who have been denied their own.
Why did silenced observers recognize him instantly?
People who have lived through emotional misuse recognize sincerity the way a starving body recognizes food. There's no confusion, no hesitation, no doubt. When I saw Starry Night, it wasn't admiration, it was recognition. It was the sense of meeting someone who had lived through a similar emotional landscape, even across time. That's why the painting restored me. That's why it revealed me. That's why it felt like it was speaking directly to the part of me that had been muted. Vincent painted with emotional sincerity, not performance. That sincerity shaped the paint, and the paint shaped me.
What is universal transmission of emotional truth?
Emoto's metaphors help explain this transmission. Intention matters. Vincent's intention was honest. Emotional truth has physical consequences. His brushstrokes carry that truth. Distortion creates chaos. Sincerity creates coherence. My body responded to that coherence. The body responds to emotional environments. So, when I say Vincent painted for the emotionally silenced, I mean this. He painted from a place of emotional truth so uncompromised that anyone who has been denied their own truth feels seen by it. He didn't paint to save us. He painted from the place we needed to be saved from. And that's why it reaches us.
Thor, you've been describing how Starry Night restored coherence inside you, a kind of internal recalibration after years of emotional distortion. I want to take that clarity and turn it toward a question many survivors struggle with. Why is it so hard to see the bigger picture while you're inside a narcissistic abusive relationship? You've hinted at it before, the suppliant man dynamic, the way the narcissist's emotional economy functions almost like a form of psychological voodoo. From your perspective, what made it so difficult to see what was happening while you were still inside it?
The simplest answer is that narcissistic abuse collapses your ability to hold perspective. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly through 1,000 microadjustments. Narcissistic supply and demand are not just a behavioral pattern, it's an emotional economy that reorganizes your inner world. The narcissist needs admiration, validation, and emotional energy to maintain their fragile self-structure. And you, as the partner, become the primary supplier. Over time, your emotional reality becomes secondary to their needs. Your intuition gets overridden. Your boundaries get softened. Your sense of self becomes porous. And because the shifts are incremental, you don't notice the bigger picture disappearing, you just adapt.
You've used the word voodoo before, not literally, but as a metaphor for the psychological spell narcissists cast. What does that mean to you?
It means manipulation becomes invisible from the inside. Narcissistic abuse works like a spell because it alters your perception without your awareness. The narcissist doesn't need to restrain you physically, they reshape your emotional reality. They do it through intermittent reinforcement, idealization followed by devaluation, emotional withdrawal, selective affection, subtle punishments, rewriting of events, strategic silence, conditional approval. Each of these techniques destabilizes your internal compass. You start doubting your own signals. You start relying on the narcissist to tell you what is real. That's the voodoo, the way your inner world becomes entangled with theirs, until you can't tell where you end and they begin.
So, the loss of perspective isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a consequence of the emotional economy.
Exactly. Narcissistic abuse is not about stupidity or weakness. It's about systemic distortion. Several things happen simultaneously. Your nervous system becomes dysregulated. You live in fight-flight-freeze cycles. Your emotional bandwidth shrinks. You're too busy managing their moods to reflect on your own. Your identity becomes reactive. You adapt to avoid conflict, not to express truth. Your self-trust erodes. You begin to believe their version of events on your own. Your world narrows. The relationship becomes the center of your emotional universe. When all of that is happening, the bigger picture isn't just hard to see, it becomes structurally inaccessible. You're not able to step back. You're in survival mode.
And the supply and demand dynamic reinforces that survival mode.
Completely. The narcissist's need for supply creates a constant emotional demand on you. You become responsible for their self-esteem, their mood, their sense of identity. And because the narcissist rewards you intermittently, affection one moment, withdrawal the next, your brain becomes conditioned to chase the next moment of approval. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You're not choosing the relationship anymore. You're trying to regulate the emotional chaos they create. That's why the bigger picture disappears. You're not looking outward. You're looking for the next moment of relief.
Why does Starry Night break the spell? And then you encounter something coherent, something sincere, and your system recognizes it.
Yes, that's why the moment was so powerful. Narcissistic dynamics distort your internal patterns. Vincent's sincerity restored them. His painting carried emotional integrity, something I hadn't felt in years. My body recognized it instantly. It was like stepping out of fog into clarity. The spell broke because I encountered something that didn't distort me, something that didn't demand anything from me, something that didn't twist my perception, something that simply was. That's why it restored me. That's why it revealed me. That's why it freed me.
Thor, as we come to the end of this conversation, I want to take a moment to reflect on the depth and clarity you've brought to every part of this dialogue. We've moved through Masaru Emoto's metaphors, Vincent's sincerity, the physics of emotional resonance, the internal collapse caused by narcissistic dynamics, and the moment of restoration you experienced in front of Starry Night. What stands out most is how you've woven these threads into something coherent, a narrative that honors both the science as metaphor and the lived emotional truth beneath it. You've shown how Emoto's ideas, even when taken symbolically, offer a powerful framework for understanding what happens inside a person who has lived through emotional distortion. You've articulated how intention shapes internal landscapes, how sincerity restores coherence, and how art can act as a corrective frequency. And you've done it with a level of honesty and nuance that makes the entire conversation feel grounded, human, and deeply resonant. Thank you for trusting this space enough to explore all of that. Thank you for naming the parts of your experience that are often invisible, and for giving language to the internal shifts that many people feel but struggle to articulate. Your reflections don't just describe healing, they model it.
Thank you. Truly. Being part of this interview has helped me articulate things I've carried for a long time without words. It's allowed me to connect the dots between emotional experience, metaphor, art, and the physical reality of what happens inside a person who has lived through distortion. And it's helped me see my own story with more clarity, not as something broken, but as something that was reorganizing itself all along. I'm grateful for the space, the questions, and the chance to speak from a place of coherence rather than confusion. It's been meaningful. It's been grounding. And I'm glad I got to be part of it.
To everyone who has listened to Thor's story today, thank you. These conversations ask for presence, patience, and a willingness to sit with truths that are often difficult to name. Thor has shared experiences that many carry silently, and by listening, you've created a space where those truths can breathe. Stories like his remind us that healing is not abstract, it's lived, felt, and rediscovered in moments of clarity, connection, and courage. Thank you for being here, for witnessing, and for allowing this dialogue to matter.